culture is increasingly hostile to Christians. Can we turn the tide, or is it too late? Let's talk about it with Jim Denison on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And we're so glad you're here. As I say often and mean each time I say it, you always have a seat at our table. And in case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is here, and the Winter Olympics have inspired him profoundly. Matthew, you just completed a marathon, right?
That's right. This past weekend, all 172 episodes of Seinfeld. I had a vision and did a little Seinfeld marathon. And
did you beat your old time?
I did. Feels good to be a winner.
Yeah, I ran around the block about 18 times and then put the block under the bed and back to sleep. Our video director, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. John does his best to make us look good. And if you think it's bad, it could be a whole lot worse. And Dr. George Bingham is here. He's the president of Key Life. When it comes to watching the Super Bowl, George leads the league in passing out before halftime. And then Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of this program. At halftime, Kathy, at her Super Bowl party, will hand out probably a few COVID tests for us. And we have a great guest on this program, Dr. Jim Denison. He's a former pastor, and then he had an attack of sanity and ran as fast as he could. And currently he serves as CEO and co-founder of Denison Ministries. He also authors the Daily Article. And Jim, and we'll give you some contact information later. Jim speaks to cultural issues at denisonforum.org and drjimdenison.com, as well as on radio, TV, podcasts, and social media. He also speaks at events and seminars and churches and is a frequent guest on radio and television programs. Of course, the best one being Steve Brown, etc. Jim has authored more than 30 books. Every time he burps, they publish it, including the latest, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, The Coming Tsunami, Why Christians Are Labeled Intolerant, Irrelevant, Oppressive, and Dangerous, and how we can turn the tide. Jim, thanks for being with us. I know how busy you are.
Oh, Steve, this is my great honor and privilege to be with you today. And you described my writing style succinctly and perfectly, I would say. And our editors would certainly agree with you. So they would like me to burp a little less so they could get a little more constructive work done, I would think. But and I want that block, by the way. I want to be able to run around the block like you do. So I can get to Seinfeld. I know how to do that. I know how to do that marathon. But I need that block. So maybe we can talk about that off air.
By the way, that burping and publishing thing came from R.C. Sproul. He used to laugh and say every time I burp, they publish it.
He had no unpublished thoughts, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's right. He doesn't have to write anymore.
Exactly.
He just sits and praises, and he's home now.
That's right.
Jim, number of years ago, when I was in graduate school, and it was one that had been founded as a method at Boston University.
Okay.
And there was a district attorney from Alabama, district superintendent. I start thinking politically, and it's hard to change it. And he had come to speak, and they were losing lots of members in Alabama. Yeah. And it was racist. A lot of people were leaving the church because of the stand that the Methodist Church had officially taken. And the bishop was upset with the lowering of the income stream and all that goes with it. And this district superintendent said to the bishop, I wouldn't worry about it none. We're just getting down to the muscle in this church. I read your book, and it's not an up book. It really forces you to face the reality of a tsunami, to coin a phrase. And it is scary, and it's dark, and there isn't a whole lot of hope, although there is hope in your book, and we're going to talk about that. Yeah. But this shouldn't be a surprise to Christians, should it?
Absolutely should. No, we've been in this place a long time. These earthquakes that I'm talking about, these underwater earthquakes, have been going on for decades, some of them for centuries, actually, if you want to look at it that way. And I think your friend's right about muscle in the context of what God's doing through this moment. Quick story, if I could. My first time to Cuba. I've been down to Cuba 10 times over the years, and I love to go back just to see New Testament Christianity in action, Book of Acts stuff. And so first time down there, I was apologizing to this pastor for all the persecution they were facing, and told him I was praying for persecution to lessen against his people. Don't know what I could do, but praying about it. He asked me to stop doing that. He said the persecution was strengthening their church. It was purifying their church. And then he told me that Cubans were praying for persecution to increase in the United States for the same purpose. Well, I can tell you after 20 years that God pays attention to Cuban prayers. And maybe he was onto something. Maybe your friend was onto something. Yeah. It's the Tertullian, blood of the martyr, seed of the church. Maybe that's what God's up to these days.
I'm not too sure. And by the way, as you know, we shouldn't be surprised. Jesus talked about it. And, he didn't get a whole lot of PR from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I don't know why we expect anything better. We've had it great in this country.
Boy, haven't we, though?
In fact, institutional Christianity has. But
that's right. And that's part of the problem, Steve. We've been at the table for so long, we think it's our table, And maybe now we're starting to figure out it wasn't our table. And maybe a lot of what we thought was working wasn't really working. And maybe
I think you're right on. I really do. I have a friend in Atlanta who published a book called Minority Rules. And the theme of that book was that we were once in a minority. We had the money and the power, and the pathway to Washington was well worn between Washington and the church. And he said, things have changed now. We're going to have to do it Jesus' way. And he said, these are some rules for a new place where we find ourselves as institutional Christians. And that is in the minority.
Right. We're back in the first century, which is not a bad place to be,
Yeah, it's not a bad place to be. And maybe that's the upside of postmodernity. Maybe it's put us in a place where the things that we thought worked don't work anymore.
Right.
I want you to, in your book, you talk about 4 particular areas where and I suspect you could name 10, but 4 that you centered in on. Why don't you begin to let us know what those 4 are, and then we'll probably take a break in the middle of that and come back and finish the list. But take your time, because this is important stuff.
Well, thank you for the privilege of doing that, my friend. So I'm working off the tsunami idea, the tidal wave you see caused by earthquakes you can't see. So I put 4 of them together in kind of a chronological and maybe causal kind of relationship to each other. Some are not a surprise. Some are others maybe not as known to us. So the first place you start with all of this is the rejection of biblical truth. So 92% of Americans, recent survey said they are their own sole determiner of moral truth. Saw a survey the other day, 79% of Americans say it doesn't matter what you believe so long as you're tolerant of the beliefs of others. Only 24% of Americans think the Bible is the literal word of God. The percentage who say the Bible is myth has doubled in the last 20 years. Post-truth was the word of the year back in 2016. So how did we get here? The long answer takes you back, as you know, to Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment and postmodernism and all that. But the short answer is we now believe that truth is how my mind interprets my senses. Well, your mind isn't mine. Your senses aren't mine. So there can be no such thing as objective truth, which is, of course, an objective truth claim. But nonetheless, we're in this post-truth culture. The Bible's a diary of religious experience. You have no right to force your beliefs on me. Well, that's foundational to the second, which is a rejection of biblical morality. The third, a rejection of biblical witness. And then the fourth, a rejection of biblical faith itself, as we talk about Christianity as dangerous. But we have to nail that first one down because it's foundational to the other three that we can talk about in just a bit.
Jim, we'll follow up that you with great skill in this book. And I suspect for some Christians, it will be a revelation. You know, we were singing our hymns and praying our prayers, and we weren't looking. And in the dark, some things that were happening are pretty scary for those of us who really believe this truth. I loved what you said about truth. And there is no absolute truth, is an absolute truth claim.
Absolutely.
The consistency of Joe Pagan sometimes absolutely amazes me. Hey guys, we're going to come back like Jesus. Don't go away. Hey, we're glad you're with us. We're talking to Dr. Jim Denison, and his new book is called The Coming Tsunami: Why Christians Are Labeled Intolerant, Irrelevant, Oppressive, and Dangerous, and How We Can Turn the Tide. And I expect that one of the ways, and we're going to talk about it later, is by becoming a bit more dangerous than we are. Pagans have us figured, and we say nice things because we're nice people and we think nice thoughts. Maybe we got to do what Jim does and be sort of in your face. Jim, before the break, you were beginning to tell us of the 4 tsunamis that we're facing, probably a revelation to some people who are listening. And you started with truth, and you said that we have a crisis of truth, and that most Americans don't believe there is any truth except their own. You might want to say more about that and then continue with the other 3.
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, that first one makes the Bible a diary of religious experience, right? It's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John experienced, but you have no right to force that on me any more than I can force the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita on you, as long as we just all get along. D.A. Carson makes a great point. Tolerance used to mean you had the right to be wrong. Now tolerance means there's no such thing as wrong. You can't be wrong in this culture. And to say that is to be intolerant, which is the cardinal sin of our culture. Well, that leads to the second earthquake that I'm describing, which is a rejection of biblical morality. So now we're back in the 60s. We're talking about this so-called sexual revolution. You really go back to 53 and Hugh Hefner in 1960, legalizing birth control so couples can have sex outside of marriage with less fear of pregnancy. You get up to 69 and the Stonewall riots and LGBTQ activism that starts by normalizing LGBTQ behavior. That's popular culture, will and grace, so forth. Then to legalizing, and that would be to Obergefell. Now we're in stigmatizing those who disagree and then criminalizing those who disagree. And that would be the so-called Equality Act and things like that. So in this time frame, in this context, now I'm homophobic, I'm bigoted, prejudiced, narrow-minded, and discriminatory because of this so-called second earthquake. Well, the third, and we can certainly come back to talk about these, it takes us to critical theory, and critical race theory is one application. It says the majority group is by definition oppressing the minority group. It's a Marxist construct. Christians are the majority, so we are by definition oppressors of minorities. And then it leads to the last earthquake, which is a rise of a secular ideology, which says religion is not just oppressive, it is dangerous. Religion flies planes into buildings. It causes 9/11s, clergy abuse scandals, spends money on buildings instead of people, and heaven instead of earth. Now, authenticity is the path to flourishing. And if you disagree, your religion must be replaced, and it is dangerous. That comes together. All of that comes together to create the moment where we find ourselves. Now, aren't you glad we're having this conversation, huh? But there's hope here. There's good news here. But you can't have to start with the bad news to get to the good news, I think.
Do you think that a lot of Christians have been intimidated into silence?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so much easier to be that way. I feel that way. I don't want to be called homophobic and bigoted and prejudiced, narrow-minded, discriminatory. I'm getting nothing out of this. I don't have an axe to grind in this, a dog in the hunt. It's so much easier to try to pull back, isn't it? And then there's kind of this move in the culture. Rod Dreher, the Benedict options, I don't think he's right about this. We have to focus on our own kids. Don't assume because your kids go to church on Sunday, they're not being inundated by this culture on Monday. And there's part of it, I think, inside all that as well. But at the end of the day, it doesn't work. I have to breathe out to breathe in. I've got to give to receive. Love going to Israel. I've led more than 30 tours to Israel. So we always get up to the Sea of Galilee, and it's the old illustration. Water flows into the Sea of Galilee and flows out. Water flows into the Dead Sea, but doesn't flow out, and that's why it's the Dead Sea. Christianity doesn't work in retreat. The spiritual armor doesn't cover the backside. If we're not willing to go forward with salt and light, we can't really be followers of Jesus, I think.
Oh, man. George?
Jim, my impression of kind of the Christian experience in Europe is that it just kind of became almost irrelevant, like a museum kind of a thing or whatever. Do you see that kind of direction, or are we likely to experience more kind of direct hostility and persecution, that kind of thing? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, great question. I think it's in those as phases, as it were. I've been in Europe a lot as well, and you go in the cathedrals that are so empty and are museums now. Now you're going back to Kant in the 18th century, the idea that truth is personal, individual, and subjective. That swept the European continent. It became conventional wisdom there. It makes the church just a purveyor of social agency, if even that. We didn't get it in this country till after World War II because of a thing called Scottish common sense realism. But nonetheless, a lot of people that don't know Kant are now influenced by it. But yeah, it got to Europe a long time before us. And that's the first preferred move of our secular culture, is to do what the Europeans did. Pull back, be a secular service agency, don't confront where the culture is going, kind of go with the culture, a Christ of culture move, as Richard Niebuhr would speak of. If you won't do that, now you're facing the wrath of the culture. Now it's a so-called Equality Act. Now it's the Religious Exemption Accountability Project that threatens $4 billion in federal funding to faith-based colleges. Now it was the op-eds in the USA Today last year during the Sweet 16 castigating NCAA because Oral Roberts was being allowed to be in the Sweet 16 when they were homophobic, according to these editorials. And so, yeah, if you won't do the European deal and just kind of pull back and withdraw, then we are facing a frontal assault. And it's a legal thing. It's a cultural thing. It's a replacement ideology. And so I think we're going to see both of those, depending on how you react to the tsunami that's in the midst of our culture.
Oh, man, that's good. What is the liberty thing?
Yeah, at the end of the day, what we're looking at with the so-called Equality Act, it's already passed the House twice. It's in front of the Senate now. President Biden promises to sign it if it gets to him. It amends the 1964 Civil Rights Act to forbid discrimination on the basis of the sexual orientation, gender identity. And then crucially, it forbids any appeal to the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So here's what it would mean in practice very quickly. Our ministry, pick on us, has a morality code that we expect of our staff that affirms what we think of as biblical marriage, biblical sexual morality. So let's say one of our staff members gets into a same-sex marriage, and we release that staff member on that basis, and they file a lawsuit, and a judge issues an injunction. If I don't obey the injunction, I go to jail. That's the outcome
to do that?
Of the Equality Act, if it became law. That's the purpose of it. And the larger piece behind it, whether it becomes law or not, is what's the motive behind it, which is I'm just as dangerous for not doing a same-sex wedding as if I wouldn't do an African-American wedding. It's exactly the same idea. There was a senator who likened my position to KKK members burning crosses in front yards. And that's the move we have to understand that's happening in the culture today.
And I think, Jim, that we need to be willing to go to jail.
Yes, we do.
Willing to be prosecuted, willing to be persecuted.
Yeah.
Because our brothers and sisters have been facing that all over the world, and
That's
we
right.
haven't. We ought to be thankful for the years we've had and then make an obscene gesture and speak truth clearly. Our guest has a great book, and you ought to get it because it's a revelation, The Coming Tsunami, why Christians are labeled intolerant, irreverent, oppressive, and dangerous, and how we can turn the tide. When we come back, we're going to look for a fix and pray that there is one, so don't go away. Hey, thanks for joining us. We're hanging out with Dr. Jim Denison. You can keep up with Jim at drjimdenison.com and on social media at Denison Forum.
Jim, it feels like so much of this, of these tsunamis that are happening, can be put back at the feet of postmodernism. I clearly remember an incident. I think it was not even 5 years ago, which feels impossible, but I shared a thing online. There was some kind of Google form I was filling out, and some survey says male, female, other. And I literally shared it thinking with the thought of, look at this coding error. Isn't that funny, everybody? At that point, only 5 years ago, it literally did not even cross my mind that, like, no, that's not why it's there. And it felt like a crossing over point. Mm-hmm. It's less about whatever the identity stuff is. It's more of a willful untethering to objective, self-evident truth. And once we have crossed that line, I'm curious your input. What kind of conversations can follow that? How do you connect? How do you make an argument? What is there? Is it just love people and hope for the best? What do we do here?
No, it's a great question. You're exactly right about that. Francis Schaeffer called it the line of despair. When you get to a place where you give up objective truth and you've given up everything else that goes with that, right? So it's really, I think, three responses. The first we've already talked about, and that's it fails the test of logic. To say there's no such thing as truth is to make a truth claim. No such thing as absolute truth. We're absolutely sure of it. Well, the second is, I think, on more a practical level, if all truth is personal, individual, and subjective, does that make the Holocaust just Hitler's truth? Does that make 9/11 just Al-Qaeda's truth? How do you have a culture if you can't have seatbelt laws, if you can't have objective morality? But then the third play here is, I think, the most biblical, actually, the most New Testament, and that is to demonstrate the relevance of my truth in my life. And if you'll see that in my life in a transforming way, I think you'll be attracted to that truth, and you'll make my truth your truth, and that's how you'll meet the truth. Quick example, first century Christians didn't have the political means to outlaw slavery, although they certainly would have if they could have. They just didn't have that means. So they go to the slave markets, buy the slaves, and set them free. Babies were abandoned in the ancient world, and they go out to the trash heaps and rescue the babies. By Acts 17:6, they turn the world upside down. They're demonstrating relevance and getting to reality that way. And I think that's kind of where we are now. If I can show you the difference Jesus makes in my life, you'll be attracted to that in your life, and that's how you'll meet the truth for yourself. So relevance becomes really critical to this conversation.
Interesting. Live it out. It becomes self-evident. It seems like it'd be a lot easier just to argue with people. I mean, just call them names and call it a day.
There you go. Win arguments and lose souls. I had a friend in high school that carried a huge Bible with him everywhere and a huge cross. And his favorite verse was, "Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake." And I wanted to say, well, you got the first part right, but the second part, maybe not, Easy to make enemies and call them enemies, Not exactly, I think, the Jesus move here.
Yeah, really. Wow. Jim, we may have to get into this a little bit on the other side of the break, but I think that, and I could be completely wrong, but I think that there's been an understanding over the last however many years in the church of how we have failed when it comes to the issue of our African-American brothers and sisters and race relations and that kind of thing. And I think there's been a movement. I know a lot of scenarios, and I'm sure we all do, where I think we're trying to do our best to move in that direction. Mm-hmm. I struggle with this issue of CRT because I feel like I don't know. I don't have children in school. Parents who are dealing with the subject matter on all of that coming up in school have very, very strong feelings on that, which I understand. But it's like, even with our African-American brothers and sisters and their lives that they have lived in different scenarios, obviously, than ours, we don't seem to be able to come to as much of an understanding when it comes to that issue. There's this great divide there about that. In other words, if you really want to understand what we have been through and why this is so important to us, you need to pay attention to this. And on the other side, you have the white Christian population, not in totality, but saying there are some places here in this that I just don't feel like I can go. Can you, when we get back, can you kind of like break that down a little bit and what do we do with this? Because I have some African-American friends right now that I really want to have a much better relationship with them than the kinds of relationships that I had when I was a kid growing up 50 years ago. I mean, I really do want it to be different. But it seems very complicated to me.
Well, it is really very complicated. And after the break, we'll talk about it. There are 5 different ways, I think, of relating to CRT from a biblical point of view. And we can unpack some of those real briefly and kind of talk about that a bit. But I share your grief. I share your frustration. I shared this kind of complexity that we find ourselves in this space. So let's definitely come back and unpack some of that and talk about ways we can interpret this and some real practical landing spots, I think, where there's some real good news and some real hope here as well.
That'd be great.
And by the way, just so the people who are watching and listening know, Kathy's not just talking. She has made major efforts to reach out to her African-American friends in some very creative ways, and it's been quite effective. Well, we need 4 or 5 hours with you, Jim. 1 hour doesn't do it, but we're going to do our best when we talk about race when we come back. And if you touch that dial, What a great time we're having with Dr. Denison. And you got to get the book because we're just scratching the surface. It sounds so dark and down that there's no hope. But in fact, it's a very hopeful book, and it gives some very practical and good advice about what Christians can do. The name of the book is The Coming Tsunami: Why Christians Are Labeled Intolerant, Irrelevant, Oppressive, and Dangerous, and How We Can Turn the Tide.
Jim, before the break, I was way too wordy, but the bottom line is you're going to tell us the good, the bad, the indifferent, and whatever else you want to tell us about CRT.
Well, I'll do my best to do that briefly as I can, because as you said, it's a very complex subject. So you start with critical theory, which is the 20s and 30s in Germany, the so-called Frankfurt School. Max Horkheimer coined the phrase critical theory in 1937. It's a Marxist construct, which says that life is experienced in classes. You have majority classes and minority classes. And by definition, majority classes are oppressing minority classes. That's how they got to be majorities. That's what critical theory believes. In the 1970s, that gets made a critical race theory and a legal construct. Is where it really kind of begins, is in that space. And from there to today, there's this argument that racial minorities, and they could be also sexual minorities, they can be gender minorities, that racial minorities are by definition being oppressed by racial majorities. And now we need to do something systemically about that, is essentially what CRT claims, critical race theory. I would suggest 5 ways of looking at what we've just said through a biblical lens. The first would be the argument, the claim that I would certainly make, which is that systemic racism exists today. That's a CRT claim, and I believe they're absolutely right about that. The Bible speaks of us as fallen, each of us as fallen, each of us as sinners. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And that sin affects culture. Romans 8:22, that creation groans in travail. And I believe there's a sinfulness to humanity that is expressed by systemic racism. A few examples of that. Survey recently, African-American sounding names had to send 50% more resumes than white sounding names to get a callback. It's a fact that Black people are twice as likely to be put to death for killing white people as white people for killing Black people. Black people serve 20% longer prison sentences than white people, 38% more likely to be put to death than white people for the same crime. I could go on. Systemic racism being a reality in the culture. A second application is personal racism. Am I myself on some level acting, or at least appearing to act in ways that are racist, that are discriminatory? I have to admit that possibility, because I am a sinner myself. In fact, I've got an African-American very dear friend who does audits with me regularly. I've empowered him to do that. When I write something or say something that crosses a line in his experience, he tells me that, and we struggle through that. We talk through that together. So there's a personal dimension. A third lane would be personal reparations for personal sin. I think that's biblical as well. You're thinking about Zacchaeus paying back as he is stolen, thinking about Jesus' statement, when you bring your gift to the altar, your brother has something against you, go make it right with your brother and then present the gift. So personal reparations for personal crime, I think, is absolutely in a biblical construct. Now, the fourth is cultural reparations, where I, as a white person, we as white people must pay for the crimes of white people. I understand that there's systemic racism, but in my reading, that is not itself a biblical construct. The soul that sins, it shall die. I'm not responsible for the sins of other people. One of the criticisms of CRT is it doesn't take personal sin seriously enough, doesn't take personal agency seriously enough because of the Marxist construct. So I'm struggling with cultural reparations, class reparation. Then the fifth, very briefly, would be historic reparation, where I'm making reparation for sins of previous generations, going all the way back to 1619 when the first enslaved individuals were brought to this continent. And again, I don't see that as a biblical move. The Bible says the sons are not responsible for the sins of the parents. And so fourth and fifth, when you get into cultural and historic reparations, I'm going to struggle biblically. But the first three, systemic, personal, and then personal reparation, I think are very much biblical categories. Now, all of that will make somebody mad in terms of CRT, right? What's inside all that? In terms of whether it's being taught in schools, that's another conversation. Hard to find classes calling themselves critical race theory. But if you're thinking of anti-race ideology, Ibram Kendi and others being taught in sociology classes and literature classes, history classes, psychology classes, most definitely. You can find examples of that across the country. And that's why you're seeing so much furor with parents and school districts and all that's inside that as well. Bottom line, Christians should be on the forefront of fighting against racism. Ministers were helped leading the fight in the 60s. It's William Wilberforce outlawing slavery. We should be on the very tip of the spear of fighting against the sin of racism and racial prejudice in this culture. And the fact we haven't done as well with that as we should is part of, I think, the indictment that we're facing in the culture as we see it today. So I hope that helps. That's a pretty quick synopsis of a pretty complex subject, but that's at least how I evaluate it.
All right, Jim, before we jump off a bridge, you have a couple of minutes to give us some hope. Talk to us.
You bet. It's faith, hope, and love. 1 Corinthians 13:12. Let's place faith in God as our King. In the Bible, God's a king. In our culture, God's a hobby. We separate Sunday from Monday, spiritual from secular, religion from the real world. Start every day by making God king of your life. Be filled with the Spirit, Ephesians 5:18 says. Start every day by surrendering to him and asking him to make you part of the solution, not the problem. Plus faith in God as your king because he's still on his throne. He's not taking notes from this conversation. None of this surprises him. He redeems all that he allows. So make him king of your life. Hope is in the kind of spiritual awakening we so desperately need. We're seeing it around the world, Steve. That's the great good news here. More Muslims have come to Christ in the last 15 years than the previous 15 centuries. Many after seeing visions and dreams of Jesus. I could give you stories. People I've met in Bangladesh, in the Middle East, with these incredible stories. I've been to Cuba 10 times. 1 million Cubans have come to Christ in the last 10 years. God's on his throne, so pray for that awakening and let it start with me. And then love is speaking the truth in love. Ephesians 4:15. I'm a beggar helping beggars find bread. I'm just as broken as anybody else is. They're not the enemy. We're together seeking God's best for us as a culture. We're paying forward the grace we've received. So if I've got faith in God as king, hope in what the Spirit can do in our culture, and if I'm sharing the truth in love, I'm part of the solution. And God is using me as salt and light. And the good news is the light always defeats the dark every single time because God is still on his throne.
So you are positive in
Yes.
the midst of the dark, you see some light.
I do. Absolutely.
And as you live that out, are you finding that faith, hope, and love effective?
Thank you. What a great practical question. That helps me when I get up in the day. My day is spent looking at news and engaging news biblically and spiritually. And man, can that be depressing. Man, can that be tough. And I've had to learn, Steve, as I'm up against a really tough story, really tough subject, just to say, God, okay, I'm going to make you king of this. I'm not going to try to solve this. You solve it. It's yours, not mine. And in that, there's a peace that passes understanding that Jesus gives.
Jim, that is so good. And we've loved this hour. I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely.
By the way, you got to get this book. It needs to be discussed, disseminated throughout the church and among Christians, and we need to deal with these issues. The coming tsunami, why Christians are labeled intolerant, irrelevant, oppressive, dangerous, and how we can turn the tide, by Dr. James Denison. And you can get it wherever good books are sold. If they don't carry it, don't patronize that particular outlet. Jim, God bless you, brother. Thanks
My
for
privilege today. Steve, thank you,
guys.
so much.
We're going to tell you who will do it unto next week. Don't go anywhere. What a good hour with Jim Denison. I suspect that some of you are angry. I winced a couple of times as he talked, but he speaks truth. And when you hear truth, it gets to you. You know, one of the best things about being a Christian is that you don't have anything to defend. I mean, you've already announced to the world when you became a Christian that you're messed up, that you're sinful, that you're fallen, that there isn't any sin of which you're not capable. That's basic stuff to the Christian faith. And so when we begin to realize the details of what that means, e.g., about race, we shouldn't wince. We should say, oh, I repent. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to repent to my brothers and sisters. And in that sense, the way that critical race theory brings this kind, as I believe that critical race theory is dangerous. It divides us. It creates hatred. It builds walls. And if we pursue it that way, we're never going to get it fixed. And so it takes African-American Christians who are willing to forgive and honkies like us who are willing to confess. And that shouldn't be a big deal if you're a Christian. That's why I don't think the pagans have a solution. I really don't. If you think this is going to come out of Washington, you've been smoking the wrong stuff. If you think it's coming out of academic institutions, you're out of your mind. We're the only ones who have the answers. And I think Jim expressed that. And we've got to put that faith, love, and hope into practice and to do it every day of our lives. Thank God that we're forgiven when we don't. Kathy, who's going to be on next week?
Oh, wait till you hear this title. Our friend Jefferson Bethke, who's been with us before, his new book is titled Take Back Your Family from the Tyrants of Burnout, Busyness, Individualism, and the Nuclear Ideal. So there.
And we're batting 1,000 on up broadcasts.
Aren't we? Yeah.
We'll do one on taxes and death the next two.
We'll do that before the 15th of April. We'll talk about taxes.
That's right. That'll work. Guys, it's time for us to leave. So put a fork in us. We're done. But that doesn't mean we're done forever. We're going to come next week, same time, same place. And that's our fond hope that you'll join us then, too. And between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. That gives you a wide, wide berth.